In this Christchurch cemetery, the grave of a young Irish woman was once a macabre tourist attraction. Margaret Burke was murdered in 1871, and according to local legend, she did not rest in peace. Her headstone began bleeding. Unfortunately today, the headstone no longer exists, and all we have is this photo. But from the position of the graves in the background, we can place the bloodstained headstone right about here. The headstone bled for many years until eventually its notoriety attracted the wrong sort of attention. In 1961, the headstone was smashed by vandals, but this photo, taken soon after, clearly shows the source of the legend, this dark-coloured stain in the middle, which was said to be the blood of the unfortunate Margaret Burke. Not long after this photo was taken, the headstone pieces disappeared, but the legend lived on in Christchurch folklore. So much so that when we tried to find the missing pieces, the Christchurch Press ran the story on page 3. In 1871, this was the rich part of town, and it's somewhere around here that Margaret Burke met her untimely end, aged 21. She worked for one of Canterbury's leading families, the Robinsons, who rented a mansion near this corner. Margaret Burke joined the Robinson household as a cook. Her employer, William Robinson, was famous for preferring to pay with cash, hence his nickname, Ready Money Robinson. He was a well-known landowner with a huge estate at Cheviot in North Canterbury, where he, his wife and 5 daughters spent much of their time. In early 1871, though, the family lived here in Christchurch. After making his fortune farming in Australia, William Robinson enjoyed the trappings of an English gentleman. His household was run in the traditional upstairs-downstairs fashion. He had a black butler, Simon Cedino, whom he'd hired in Panama. And for 5 years, master and manservant got on well, but then the relationship soured.
At some stage, probably other returning travellers passed through Panama and came out with the story that, far from being as recommended, he had quite a bad reputation as a troublemaker.
Cedino would later claim Robinson called him Blackheart, sometimes in front of guests. Possibly this was a reference to Cedino's alleged bad reputation in Panama. Cedino wanted to leave and asked Robinson to pay him out, but for some reason Robinson kept stalling. Although Cedino's relationship with Mrs. Robinson remained cordial, Cedino was an angry man getting angrier. Downstairs amongst the servants, Cedino was known for having a temper. He was particularly sensitive about his plans to marry. He claimed he was engaged to a European woman named Mary, but no one knew of her or had even seen her, and the other servants accused him of making it all up. He didn't like that. Although English was his second language, Simon Cedino had no trouble understanding he was the butt of everyone's jokes, in particular of the cook Margaret Burke and the scullery maid Catherine Glynn.
They were bright, lively, they would have teased. You know, the stories about them teasing Cedino, yes, I can believe that from what we've managed, the picture we've managed to build up of the girls. It would never have been malicious. You know, it was just part of their nature. That's the type of girl they were.
The more Cedino claimed his marriage plans were real, the worse the teasing got.
I have been through all the files at National Archives. There was never an intentions to marry filed for Cedino, even though the reporters at the time were dealing with a very, very small community in Christchurch. Nobody came up with this woman.
It seems the mysterious Mary existed only in Simon Cedino's lonely imagination. Cedino's behaviour became increasingly erratic, at times morose and withdrawn, then suddenly hostile. He threatened Margaret on one occasion and was reprimanded by William Robinson. The servants are warned to stop teasing him, but no one realises just how far the butler has already been pushed. Then, on a hot summer's day, January the 9th, 1871, Cedino suddenly snaps. Without warning, he creeps up on Catherine Glynn. Then he rushes into the kitchen. Maggie Burke sees him coming. Maggie runs into the drawing room and she falls over a chair. Sedino catches her. A visitor hauls Sedino off. Mrs. Robinson bravely demands the knife, and surprisingly, Sedino stops and does what he's told. The madness lasted just a few minutes, but Margaret Burke lay dead and Catherine Glynn was badly cut around the face. The 5 Robinson daughters were in the house at the time, but they were unhurt. Robinson himself was on his way to Cheviot with a prize bull that he'd just bought. Later, Sedino would say that it was lucky he was away, otherwise he would have been killed too.
It sounded as if the whole city was in uproar, that this Negro had stabbed this maid for no very valid reason at all. I mean, the courtrooms were packed, the windows, people were standing outside looking through the windows, and they were all very, very anti-poor Sedino.
No one knew why he did it, and evidently no one was interested in finding out, not even his lawyer. There was no defense of provocation or insanity. The jury retired for just 10 minutes. Simon Sedino was hanged at Littleton Jail 3 months later. The Robinson family remembered Margaret Burke with a headstone here in Barbados Street Cemetery. But Margaret Burke would be immortalized by what happened next. Inexplicably, her headstone appeared to be dripping blood. The headstone was replaced with the other half of the original block from the city quarry, but it bled too. The ghost of Margaret Burke was not easily put off. Then in 1961, council worker James Inglis found the headstone smashed and took this picture. It shows the stone had a deep flaw, like this rock from the same quarry.
Stonemasons in early Christchurch often used quarry stone for memorials, but it was phased out because of the discolorations that sometimes occurred in it.
But if that's the case, why haven't more headstones got bloodstains on them?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I don't have an answer.
James had wanted to restore the famous bleeding headstone, but it went missing, apparently mixed up with cemetery rubble and used to shore up the banks of the River Avon. But there's a popular urban myth that the bits of headstone didn't just vanish, but were souvenired and ended up as doorstops in student flats. So possibly, somewhere in Christchurch, there are bits of Maggie Burke's headstone still bleeding. Coming up, a Danish poet turns her back on her glamorous life, her husband and her children, and runs off to New Zealand with her lover. But her dreams turn to heartache and death. In 1988, the staff at Auckland's Waikaraka Cemetery received several letters asking if a burial plot existed for a Danish woman named Ingeborg who'd committed suicide in 1904. Ingeborg was a writer and the wife of one of Denmark's most famous poets. She was meant to be buried in here somewhere, but there was no record of her. A historian named Alan Christiansen was working at the cemetery when he came across the letters about Ingeborg. Being of Danish descent himself, he was intrigued and began to hunt for her. Eventually, he discovered the burial record of an Ingeborg Madsen, but when he found the headstone, all that was left was INGE. But one of the Danish letters had included a picture of the grave, and Alan was able to match the piece of headstone he'd found with the picture. He'd discovered the final resting place of Ingeborg Stuckenberg, writer, poet, romantic icon. Danish tourists began to visit the grave, so in 1992 the Danish consulate erected this new headstone. Ingeborg Stuckenberg, born Copenhagen, Denmark, 6th of February 1866, died Auckland, New Zealand, 12th of August 1904. Alan Christensen recently brought this grave to my attention, and like him, I wanted to know more about this woman who was buried in New Zealand, but who obviously was so important to the Danes. Why did her original headstone name her as Madsen, and why did she kill herself? I contacted the Danish consul in Auckland, who told me he had several books and articles about Ingeborg and her husband Viggo. There was even a film about their lives.
This is actually a television movie. The name of it is Two Who Love Each Other, and there you see them. Viggo was at that time fairly well known, and later he became one of the best writers of poetry we have had in Denmark. Ingeborg was a wonderful, warm woman, but she was also a very talented woman. So she was painting, she was playing the piano, and as you will appreciate, she was also writing in her own right. It was probably difficult in those days for a woman to be a poet and to be accepted as a poet.
So she was obviously feeling trapped in this situation where she wasn't able to express herself in the way that she wanted.
It was difficult for her with the two children they had because she wanted to do things herself, and she had to make some tough decisions.
Which she did.
Yes. She decided to leave for New Zealand together with Hans Madsen, the gardener.
Niels gave me an email address for Hans Clementsen in Denmark. Hans is a distant cousin of Ingeborg, and it wasn't long before he was helping me to fill in the gaps. Ingeborg and Viggo had a taste for champagne. They would often entertain the successful artists, musicians, and writers who were their friends. It was a glamorous bohemian lifestyle. But Viggo and Ingeborg had a tempestuous relationship. Ingeborg was an idealistic, impulsive woman, and while she loved Viggo, she felt frustrated by the secondary role she was expected to play. Ingeborg desperately wanted to be taken seriously as a writer, and she was much more than Viggo's inspiration. The English translation of this book is beautiful words, and according to Danish scholars, Ingeborg wrote more than 2/3 of them. Yet when it was published, the author was named only as Viggo Stuckenberg. Ingeborg felt betrayed, and not long after, she tried to kill herself. Ingeborg and Viggo lived with their 2 young sons in a cottage on the grounds of a castle near Copenhagen. It was a beautiful place, but Ingeborg felt increasingly trapped. Her marriage had begun to collapse, and she was falling in love with Hans Madsen, the castle gardener. Hans was from rural Denmark, a quiet, hard-working man from outside the intellectual circles Ingeborg moved in. And Ingeborg, flouting all that was considered right and moral at the time, ran away with Hans. She left her children behind, and her family would never forgive her. But Ingeborg believed she had to break away from the restraints of a society she found stifling.
I am fighting for something, and I hope to win. Only time will show whether I succeed.
Ingeborg left behind everything she had, her position in society, her marriage, and her children. She had nothing but the dream of a new life in New Zealand with Hans and her brother Ove, who lived there. Ove had written home bragging of his wonderful new country and of the great success that he was having there. On the long journey from Europe to New Zealand, Ingeborg wrote at length about the country she intended to make her home, a place where land is cheap and work well paid. Ingeborg planned to teach piano, and Hans hoped to work as a gardener. But even before they stepped onto New Zealand soil, Ingeborg's optimism turned to apprehension.
The coast looked anything but friendly, with bare or wooded mountains and wild rugged cliffs which rose dark and threateningly from the sea.
Ingeborg's brother Orvar had written that he owned a sawmill in a town called Mamaku, 150 miles south of Auckland. And that's where they headed, from the manicured lawns of a castle in Europe to this, a tiny mill town where the scarred earth seemed to symbolize the lives of the men who toiled long hours for little pay. But Ingeborg's brother had lied. He didn't own a sawmill, he just worked in one. Ingeborg and Hans were devastated by what they found here. Hans' references from the King of Denmark about his gardening skills were useless, and there wasn't a piano in the whole town, let alone students to teach. Ingeborg poured her heart out in her writing.
Things looked very black indeed. There is absolutely nothing for a man in Hans's profession to do. Here they only need bare fists and raw strength for the axe and hard labor.
Naive romantics they may have been, but Ingeborg and Hans weren't afraid of hard work. They took a job as a married couple working on a large farm. Ingeborg spent long days cooking and washing for the men who worked the land. She threw herself into her duties and was described as a splendid worker by her employer. But her writing reveals an increasing disenchantment with her new home. The mountains are blue here just as the sky is blue, but the sun shines down on thousands of mute, frustrated hopes.
The people are the most broken down, tired, wrinkled workers. They grow old before their time, and most drown their sorrows in drink. Unable to make themselves understood in their own language, deserted and unheeded, they lie and die in their cabins. And still they come, giving up their last savings for this sorry, final disappointment.
Ingeborg's letters home also reveal her mounting despair at being rejected by her family. She only ever received 2 letters, and despite her desperate requests, neither contained any money. Her despair increased further when a Danish magazine rejected her travel articles. But more than anything, she missed her 2 sons. She begged and pleaded for news of them, but received no reply. And just when it seemed that things couldn't get any worse, Ingeborg scalded her leg badly, and the burn became infected. She never fully recovered and could no longer work. Europe, with all its civilization, becomes for Europeans like a closed Garden of Eden. Too late, he who is excluded and understands what he has lost. Ingeborg certainly understood what she had lost. She wrote to her 2 boys, imploring them not to forget her, but she never heard back, and she sank further and further into depression.
All those who think of New Zealand as the promised land should see the madhouses and read the death lists in the newspaper over here. Suicides are all considered to have been mentally deranged, but many are the letters left by those who took their own lives, showing that it was not madness, but sorrow, disappointment, grief and misery which drove them to it.
Ingeborg's last days were spent in Auckland at a Grafton Road boarding house. She was desperately homesick. She was fearful that Hans might abandon her, and shortly before her death, she may also have learned that her husband Viggo had married again, ironically to Hans' ex-wife. Ingeborg felt she had nowhere to turn. Just 15 months after arriving in Auckland, Ingeborg knew that her dream of starting a new life in New Zealand was over. On a crisp winter's morning in 1904, she waited for Hans to go outside. She then took out the revolver that Hans kept hanging on the wall. As always, it was loaded, ready to defend their home against intruders. She took it back to the desk and wrote one last letter. She begged her sons not to forget her, and she reminded them of the wonderful times they'd had together, and she told them she loved them. Even though Viggo remarried, it seems he never stopped loving Ingeborg. When he learned of her death, Viggo said, "Now everything inside me is truly broken." And his words rang true when he died 14 months later. Ingeborg's lover, Hans Madsen, was also lost without Ingeborg. He arranged for her burial and then returned to Denmark, where he too died just 6 months later. Ingeborg was a passionate idealist who wanted more from life than the conventions of her society would allow. In some ways, she may have been naive, but she knew that the path she took was a difficult one. She just didn't believe that she had any other choice.
Over here, I can leave this world with little fuss. Had I stayed at home, you could have reduced me to poor wretch, for that is what I was in Copenhagen, lonely amongst you all. I choose a greater destiny, and you may think of me as a soldier gone to war.